May 23, 1934, on Highway 154, a rural unpaved road 8 miles south of Gibbsland in Bentonville Parish, Louisiana. A long 1934 Ford Model 40 Deluxe sedan approaches its final destination. The car driven by Clyde with his longtime girlfriend and co-conspirator Bonnie Parker in the passenger seat. As the car tears down the gravel road in a slight trail of dust through the northwestern Louisiana backwoods. The infamous couple had been on a 2-year-long brutal crime spree that had left 13 people murdered and several armed robberies and burglaries in its wake. Their exploits had captured the attention of the nation and made headlines all over America for the previous 21 months as the death toll mounted and their list of heinous crimes ricocheted across the heartland from the depths of poverty and despair following the collapse of Wall Street at the tail end of the roaring 1920s and the bleak dawn of the dark years of the early and mid-1930s. This was the thick of the Great Depression and the era of infamous outlaws like John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd, whose grim exploits had captured the imagination of folks all over the country, looking for an escape from the hard times that had gripped the lives of the vast majority of Americans after the crash of 1929. A full quarter of the nation's population was out of work, and most folks blamed the big banks and Wall Street for the mess that the country was in. And to many, these vicious outlaws were seen as vigilantes, lashing out at the very institutions that they blamed for the dire straits they found themselves in. And their deadly adventures were fueled by sensationalized stories in the press that feverishly reported the crimes of these infamous outlaws, running bold headlines that captivated readers who felt jaded and victimized by the system. Clyde Chestnut Burrow was born into a poverty-stricken family that struggled to eke out a modest living on a small farm in Alessa County, Texas, within spitting distance of Dallas on March 24, 1909. The fifth of 7 children of Henry Basile Burrow and Cummy Tabitha Walker, the family would eventually settle in Dallas in 1920 and spent their first few months living under their wagon in the slums of the western end of town until they could afford to buy a tent. Burroughs' first run-in with the law came in 1926 for not returning a rental car that was then reported stolen. He and his brother Buck were arrested not long afterwards for stealing turkeys. Burrow tried his hand at holding down several legitimate jobs, but resorted to everything from cracking safes, robbing stores, and stealing cars. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker had been born in Rowena, Texas, on October 10, 1910, the middle child of 3 children born to Charles and Emma Parker. Her father was a bricklayer, but died when Parker was only 4 years old, and her mother moved the family to Cement, Texas, where Emma's parents lived in a modest house just a few miles west of Dallas. Parker's mother took a job as a seamstress, and outside of losing her father at a young age, it's said that she had a relatively normal childhood and thrived on getting attention. She often performed on stage and had dreams of becoming an actress. In her second year of high school, Bonnie Parker met a local rabble-rouser by the name of Roy Thornton, and the two dropped out of high school and were married on September 25, 1926. The whirlwind marriage was doomed from the start, and Thornton was often gone, leaving Parker for long stretches. His frequent run-ins with the law only deepened the divide between the two. Though they never formally divorced, Thornton never saw Parker again after January 1929, when she finally left him and moved back to her mom's in Dallas. Thornton was later shot and killed during a failed escape attempt from Huntsville State Prison. It is said that Burrow met Parker in January 1930 through mutual friends, and that the two became inseparable. But he was arrested not long afterwards and convicted of auto theft, and sentenced to McLennan County Jail in Waco, Texas, but would soon escape on March 11, 1930 using a handgun Parker had smuggled into the jail. Burrow was on the run for a total of 7 days before being apprehended and sent to Huntsville State Prison, where he was sexually assaulted by a fellow inmate, whom he would kill with a metal pipe, making his attacker his first known killing. But an inmate serving a life sentence took the rap for the crime, sparing Burrow of a murder charge. Burrow was released from prison in February 1932 and began an armed robbery spree of stores and gas stations with an accomplice named Ralph Fuchs, aiming to get enough cash and guns to carry out a raid on Eastland Prison. On April 9th, Fuchs and Parker were arrested after breaking into a hardware store in order to steal firearms, and Parker would serve several months for her part in the crime, but was released after a grand jury failed to indict her, while Fuchs was convicted and served time for his part in the botched burglary. He was never implicated in the later crimes that Burrow and Parker became infamous for, along with two other accomplices, Raymond Hamilton and Ross Dreyer. On August 5th in Stringtown, Oklahoma, Burrow, Hamilton, and Dreyer got into a shootout with Sheriff C.G. Maxwell and Deputy Eugene C. Moore. Burrow is said to have killed Moore in the brief gunfight that left Sheriff Maxwell wounded, and the three criminals fled the scene. On October 11th, the gang is believed to have been responsible for the murder of Howard Hall during an armed robbery of his store in Sherman, Texas. On the night of Christmas Eve 1932, at the age of 16, W.D. Jones left Dallas with Burrow and Parker, and the next day took part in the vicious murder of Doyle Johnson while stealing his car in Temple. Jones had known Burrow since his early childhood, and is said to have looked up to Burrow and craved the excitement of crime and the dark adventure of the road. On January 6, 1933, the trio was caught up in a police trap set for another wanted fugitive, and Burrow would kill Tarrant County Sheriff's Deputy Malcolm Davis, making it his fifth murder since April of 1932. On January 6, 1933, the trio was caught up in a police trap set for another wanted fugitive, and Burrow would kill Tarrant County Sheriff's Deputy Malcolm Davis, making it his fifth murder since April of 1932. In early 1933, Burrow's brother Buck was granted a pardon and released from prison, and he, along with his wife Blanche, moved in with Burrow, Parker, and Jones in their temporary hideout in Joplin, Missouri, where they held alcohol-fueled card games until late into the night. The local police attempted to raid the house, believing that it was part of a bootlegger's ring, but the gang managed to escape after a fierce firefight that left Detective Harry L. McGinnis dead at the scene, and Constable J.W. Harriman fatally wounded, and Highway Patrol Sergeant G.B. Collard seriously wounded. During the shootout, Jones was wounded in his side, and Burrow received a glancing blow from a bullet that struck his coat button, while Buck Burrow was grazed by a stray bullet. Though the group had escaped, they were forced to leave behind most of their possessions, including guns, Bonnie Parker's camera, and Buck Burrow's parole papers that were less than 3 weeks old. The photographs from Parker's camera and a poem she had written would be released to the press and became front-page news all over the country. For the next few months, the gang's criminal activities ranged from Texas to Minnesota, which involved a rash of armed robberies and several kidnappings. Due to the widespread press coverage, the gang was forced to avoid restaurants and hotels, and resorted to open-fire camping and cooking, and would bathe in rivers and creeks. 2 days later, Parker was severely injured in a car accident after the car Burrow was driving overturned. when he swerved to avoid going through a partially constructed bridge, after not noticing signs along the highway warning that the bridge was out. Parker's leg was severely burned either from the ensuing fire that enveloped the car or from battery acid to the point that she could no longer walk unaided, and either hopped on one foot or was carried around by Burrow. A nearby farm family came to their aid, and not long afterwards the gang kidnapped Collins County Sheriff George Corey and City Marshal Paul Hardy, leaving the two of them handcuffed and barbed-wired to a tree outside of Eric, Oklahoma. The gang laid low in a tourist area in Fort Smith, Arkansas, while Parker recovered from her wounds. During this time, Jones and Buck Burrow bungled an armed robbery and murdered Town Marshal Henry D. Humphrey in Alma, and the gang had to flee in spite of Parker's grave injury. For the next several months, the gang's bloody rampage would continue, leading to another fierce shootout with the law just south of Platte City, Missouri. But in the process, Buck Burrow was struck in the head and severely wounded. With Buck Burrow gravely injured, the gang laid low in Dixfield Park outside of Dexter, Iowa. Not long afterwards, the local authorities attempted to apprehend the gang and swarmed the area, but Burrow, Parker, and Jones, all three managed to escape on foot, but were forced to leave behind Buck Burrow and his wife Blanche. During the botched raid, Buck was shot in the back and he and Blanche were apprehended. Buck would finally succumb to his injuries and die just 5 days later. For the following 6 weeks, the gang's rampage of terror extended across the American heartland from Colorado to Mississippi and on up into Minnesota. In early September, the gang popped up in Dallas, where Jones parted ways with Burrow and Parker, who would later be arrested on November 16th without incident at his mom's home in Houston. Burrow continued the gang's activities with small-time accomplices, while his and Parker's family tended to her medical needs. On November 22nd, Burrow and Parker was nearly ambushed by the Dallas authorities. They were supposed to be meeting with relatives, but as Burrow drove up, he sensed it was a trap and drove past his family car, at which point authorities opened up with machine guns and a BAR. The family members in the crossfire were not hit, but a bullet passed through the car, striking the legs of both Burrow and Parker, and they fled town later that night. Not long afterwards, the grand jury formally indicted the couple for the murder of Malcolm Davis on November 28th, which was the first time Parker was officially wanted for murder. On January 16th, Burrow orchestrated a daring raid, known as the Easton Breakout from Easton Prison, that resulted in the escape of Hamilton Melvin and several others, and served as Burrow's revenge against the Texas state prison system. In the ensuing firefight, Burrow gang member Joe Palmer shot Major Joe Crossan, seriously wounding him, and Crossan would die a few days later. The Easton Breakout was a serious blow to the reputation of the Texas Department of Corrections. It was at this time that retired Texas Ranger Frank Hammer was persuaded to take the job of hunting down the Burrow gang. Hammer brought in his 4 brothers, 3 of whom were commissioned Texas Rangers, and began to tail Burrow and Parker living out of his car as he stalked them from town to town. On Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1934, near Grapevine, Texas, Highway Patrolman H.D. Murphy and Edward Bryant Wheeler stopped to assist what they assumed were stranded motorists, only to be killed in cold blood. An eyewitness who saw the incident take place said that it was Parker who fired the fatal shots that killed the officers. These vicious murders made headlines across the country and firmly turned the press and the public against the gang. Several rewards were offered that amounted to nearly $30,000. Burrow and Methvin then murdered 60-year-old Constable William Call Camel in Commerce, Oklahoma. Then the gang kidnapped Commerce Police Chief Percy Boyd, but left him unharmed in Kansas after crossing the state line. The gang left him with a few dollars, a clean shirt, and a request from Parker to tell the press that she didn't smoke cigars. After charting the gang's path on a map, Hamer accurately predicted that their next destination was a visit to Louisiana, where Methvin's family lived, which was also the gang's destined safe house in case the group was ever separated. In Shreveport, Hammer gathered a posse of 6 armed men, and on the 21st, the Texas posse members learned that Burrow and Parker were planning to visit Ivy Meth in the nearby town of Benville on the 23rd. The posse set up in the bushes on both sides of the road and waited all through the next day, but Burrow and Parker never arrived. They continued to wait through the night and into the next morning. We're about to call it quits when around 9 a.m. on May 23rd, 1934, they heard a vehicle approaching at high speed. As the car driven by Burrow blazed its way down the desolate country road on its destination with a grim fate, the men wanted to make double sure that the infamous couple wouldn't escape their trap alive, and they patiently waited for their Cordoba gray Ford to arrive at near point-blank range. At just the right time, gunfire erupted from both sides of the road, as the woods in every direction seemed to open up in a wall of gunfire that riddled the car with bullets, striking Burrow and Parker nearly simultaneously and killing them instantly. Around 130 rounds were fired into the vehicle in total, leaving it a peppered mass of bullet holes and broken glass. Inside, Burrow was hit approximately 30 times at all points of his body, and Parker had been struck by around the same number of bullets. The entire interior of the car was a graphic scene of blood and glass shards, where the couple's lifeless corpses lay slumped over once the car finally came to a rest in the ditch on the side of the road. Their deadly crime spree had finally come to a very violent and traumatic end. In the years and decades since, the story of Bonnie and Clyde's sadistic adventures have been told 1,000 times over in books, films, and news articles, and are just as exaggerated and glamorized as the original news headlines from the time they ran wild across Middle America, in the days of the Great Depression and the golden age of radio. But they were in fact cold-blooded killers who craved attention in the spotlight that the media of that era was all too willing to give to them. It was the media's sick glorification that helped fuel their drive to create even bigger headlines. This spurred them on to their final destination on that empty stretch of Louisiana highway. It was the last ride for Bonnie and Clyde.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us of our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever.